let me introduce myself. I realize I need to do that. My name is Matthew Johnson. If you're a guest here, I'm the lead pastor, and just so honored you're with us today. And I do want to acknowledge we're still working on the air conditioning. We lease this building now in preparation of moving into our new facility, and so we're kind of at their mercy. There was a report that this past week there was a chance they were going to fix it, but they have to get a crane to take a unit off of the roof, and it rained this week. So we're hoping potentially this week they can get the air conditioning fixed. And so I do apologize that it is warm in here. And again, I always just keep saying, you can wear shorts to church. And I did get permission from my grandma to say that. Last week I joked about that. She did text me, and she said, I heard you gave your church permission to be worldly. And she just put a smiley face joking around because I made the joke about it. But all right, so here's what we're going to do today. I'm actually going to do something different. I'm going to push pause on our Nuh-uh series, and we're going to come back to that next week and then conclude it the week after. But this week, I want to give a message specifically for those who call this church home. Though that said, if you're a guest, it's a great week to be here. So I'm going to spend about 2/3 of my time in a message teaching from the Word of God about something I think is relevant to all of us, but specifically to our church. And then at the end, I'm going to specifically request something of people who call this church home. And so it's kind of a more personal message on that note. But here's what I'm glad. If you're a guest, I'm glad you're here because you will get to know a little bit of our values and even kind of what season we're in as a ministry. So here's what I want to do. Before I get into the teaching, though, I want to give you the dates. Now, these are the dates that we've been waiting for. We initially had a date. We got delayed in the construction project, but now we have the final dates. And so if you're a person that has a calendar, get it out, get ready. The last Sunday we will be in our current building, this building that we're in right now, is September 23rd. So in about 5-6 weeks, I think that is, this will be our final Sunday here. And so we'll have a celebration service where we'll celebrate the faithfulness of God. And then afterwards, outside, we'll have free hot dogs and chips because, come on now, we have to be honest, we have to have some form of hot dog before we leave here, right? And so we'll have hot dogs, and it'll be a great time. Then the following Friday after that, so on September 28th, is in our new building. It is a night of worship where we are launching our new worship album. So we're releasing the worship album. It's going to be a night of celebration in our new building. It's going to be an incredible night. But note this, there will be no childcare at all in any capacity because we want every single one of our adults to be able to be a part of the service. So we are giving you a month head start on that to secure your childcare for that. And that's going to be an incredible night, the first night in our new building. It's going to be amazing. And then the first Sunday in our new building is September 30th. Now note this because this impacts you. The service times will be 9 and 11 a.m. So I need this half of the room to go to 9 a.m. I need this half to go to 11. You will go on the first and third weekends. You guys will go on the second and fourth, all right? Then we'll switch. No, I'm just kidding. But you just have to note that there's going to be a different time in that. And so obviously you're the service that's most likely going to divide between them. So 9 and 11. All right. And you'll hear more about these dates as we get a little bit closer. If you have a Bible, now you can turn to, or your electronic device, I'll give you a couple of passages. The first one is Matthew chapter 5, and the second one is Exodus chapter 25. Matthew chapter 5, Exodus chapter 25. There's been an idea concerning how God relates to us that has always just been something that I have found interesting. It's something that I acknowledge frequently as a pastor because I think it really shows a little bit of the nature of who God is. But it's something I've wondered about often, even as a child growing up, and it's this idea. God commands us to do things he doesn't need us for. What I mean by that is if God is self-sufficient. God doesn't actually need us to do things, and yet he commands us to do them. And for me, in my limited perspective, kind of my simple way of thinking, I often think that even God's choosing to continue to command us, even though we fail often, seems like an inefficient thing to do. How many of you, especially for you as parents, how many of you have ever had that moment where you're telling your kid to do something, but as your kid is doing it, you're realizing that they're not doing it the way that you want them to? And you have that tension in your mind and heart where you want to empower them and you want them to learn and grow, but in the same moment you're twitching because you're watching them do it and you're thinking like, that's not right, or you just thought like, it's just easier for me to do it. Back up, I'll do it. You guys ever have that moment? Like, I think, why doesn't God do that? Well, when we look at this truth, and I'm going to explain this, is the reality is God doesn't command us to do things for him. It's not that God's in need. It's not that God is needing us to do it. So then when we hear that, we could be tempted to think, then the sole answer is the reason God commands us to do is simply for us. And that's partially true, but that's not the complete truth. The reality is God commands us to do things both for us and also for others. Hey, let me explain it this way. I'm going to give you 5 reasons God commands us. I'm not going to really spend a ton of time explaining these or defending them because I think they're all clearly taught in Scripture. So I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly. But here's the first reason that God commands us. Because it's right. God, who defines what is right and what is wrong, commands us to do the things that are right. God is a God that defines morality. We live in a culture that says morality is up for debate, that we all can define what is right and each person has their own right, but that's not what God teaches. That's not how God thinks. That's not how God is. God defines what is right and what is wrong, and God commands us to do the things that are right. Second thing, because it's best. And this is one of the most vivid examples of the grace of God. That God, in his love of us, commands us to do things that are best for us. See, we all have been raised in a culture that has communicated to us what seems to be truth about the best way to live. Our culture communicates that the best way to live, honestly, is to put self at the top. That we live for ourselves, we defend ourselves, we think about ourselves, and if we're really being generous, then our culture says, then we think about those that are closest to us, our loved ones, and as long as we take care of ourselves and our families, then that's what we're called to do. And God says, actually, it's much bigger than that, much broader than that. And so God commands us to do things that initially, on the surface, seem counterintuitive, countercultural, but the reality is it's the way that he's always designed us to live, and so it's the best way to live. The third reason is because it grows. And what I mean by that is God commands us to do things that grows our faith. God commands us to do things that in and of itself are not things that we would naturally do. And so it challenges us to get outside of our comfort zone. Oftentimes in our lives, we have this rhythm for those who have entered into a relationship with God where initially it's like super exciting. You get saved, and I mean, even just the thought that you are being forgiven of everything wrong you've ever done. I mean, that's an incredible moment. But there's usually a moment that follows shortly after that where the reality starts to set in that you are being commanded to do things that you don't want to do. Things that are difficult, that how you're going to spend your resources, how you're going to respond to people who are evil to you, how you're going to do all kinds of things. And there's a challenging season. And in that moment, what God is doing is he is drawing you deeper, challenging, stretching you in faith. And then when you take those steps of faith, here's the awesome moment. As you take that step of faith and God comes through, it reminds you and confirms in your mind and heart that God is faithful, that God is trustworthy. And so it not only stretches, but it confirms in your life. Here's the fourth reason, because it leads. And this is when it starts to transition to where it's not simply about you. When God commands you to do something and you start to walk in obedience, it starts to lead the people around you for them to understand that there is a better way to think. There is a better way to live. There is a way that is different than the rest of the world. And this is the moment that God starts to show us that it's not all about us. It is right. It is best. It does grow us and challenge us and change us. But it also is a responsibility that we have to start to lead other people in the way that God has called us to live. And the rest of the world is not going to model it, so God calls us to be the example. And then lastly, because it's generous. God is generous. Now, isn't this true? God is generous and lets us partner with him on some really cool things. Isn't that true? Isn't that true? That God allows for us to partner with him on things that are remarkable. See, I have the privilege of being the lead pastor of this church, which means a lot of people will come and thank me for everything that our church does, which I'm really appreciative. I like that. I think sometimes they just don't know who else to say, so they come and they tell me. They'll tell me, like, thank you for what the church does in the children's ministry, and thank you for what the church does in this and that. And the truth is 99.9% of the ministry that this church does is not done by me. It's done by our staff and volunteers and incredible people. But they come to me and they tell me, and every single week, people come to me and they tell me how this church is making a difference in their lives. Even last night, I had a message from a friend that said, I have never enjoyed going to church more than I have since I've been coming to the Tree. I mean, what a touching thing to hear. And when I hear that, I think, thank you, God, that you give me and us the privilege to partner with you on some really cool things. Because in all my years of being a pastor, I've seen marriages restored. I've seen families reconciled. I've seen people set free from addictions. I've seen people, this is the most exciting part, people go from spiritual death to spiritual life. And in that, God, in his generosity, allows us to partner with him to see and to accomplish some really cool things. And so when we look at these five, this is the foundation of why God commands us to do things. Because it's right. Because it's best for us. Because it grows us and challenges us. But because also it is what is going to change the world that we live in. To lead people to a better way of thinking and living. And because God is simply generous to allow us to partner with him. And so what I want to do now is taking these five truths, I want to apply it to Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, if you don't know what this is, it's referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. And the reason it's called that is Jesus, it's his first recorded sermon, and he was teaching on the side of a hill, and so they call it Sermon on the Mount. And there was most likely hundreds, if not thousands, potentially even more of that. We don't really know the exact number, but there were a ton of people that were listening to him. Now, you need to all understand this, okay? For this to have the full weight that it's needed, you need to understand this context. What is recorded in Matthew 5, chapters 5 through 7, is the greatest thing ever spoken in the history of humanity. Okay? Of all the things that any philosopher, any teacher, anyone ever, any politician, anyone ever has ever spoken that's ever been recorded, nothing is as dynamic and important as Matthew 5 through 7. It is the reason that Jesus, regardless if you believe he is the Son of God or not, it is the reason why Jesus to this day is still considered the most influential person to ever live. It's because of what he said in Matthew 5 through 7. It is so important and so powerful that even if you're not a person of faith, if you take what he said to do in these couple of chapters and apply it to your life will be better. The reality is if the entire world were to take the truths that he communicates in these few chapters and apply it to their lives, the world would be nearly a perfect place besides natural disasters. I mean, it's incredible what he said. So when you understand the weight of what he's saying, then where he begins, in my opinion, carries a ton of weight. He starts off in what's referred to as the Beatitudes. And what he's doing in this is he's getting the audience on the same page. At this point, the audience would have been taught, so they would have thought, that God had rejected them. For the last 500 years, this culture of Judaism, no prophet had spoken. So God had not spoken through a prophet. God had been silent. It was what's often referred to as the dark period. The Pharisees were telling them that God had abandoned you because of your sin and your disobedience. Rome had come in and conquered them. And so all of this was confirmed. And so Jesus comes and he starts to say a different message. He starts to say things to them like the kingdom of God is available to you. And he starts to tell them the ways that they're blessed. He says, even when you're persecuted, you're blessed. Even when you're downcast, you're blessed, and you're broken in spirit. And he's explaining why, because what he's telling them is God actually cares about you. And so he would have drawn the audience in. Then he says something that we're going to look at in a moment. And then right after that, he goes on for the next couple chapters, challenging them with just different thought after different thought, commanding them to do behaviors that they had never heard someone command them to do before. He would actually say to them, you've heard that the standard is here, but I'm going to raise and tell you this is actually where you're supposed to be living. So he commands them and commands them and commands them over and over. But before he ever launches into that, he says something that's really interesting. In verse 13, he says to them, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. So Jesus, he's about to launch into all these teachings for them individually, for what they're supposed to do. And as he's about to challenge them, he says, but first I want you to understand, you, the audience, you're the salt of the earth. Now, when we first hear that, it's really easy for us to miss it because when we hear salt, we think seasoning, like sprinkle it on your food makes it better. In this culture, salt was used to preserve meat so that meat wouldn't decay. Meat was a precious commodity and they didn't have refrigeration, so they would put salt on it to preserve it so that it would last. And so when Jesus is talking to them, what he literally says to them is, you are going to be the reason that our culture does not spiritually decay. You're the hope of the world. This is what he says to this audience. Even though he's the Son of God, and what he's going to do is going to bring salvation to the world, he is saying to them, I'm going to partner with you, and you are going to be the hope of the world. But he says, but understand this, you're the salt. And then he poses this hypothetical. What happens if salt loses its taste? What happens if salt loses its saltiness? Now, that's absurd. You know why? You guys know this? Salt can't lose its saltiness. It's salt. It's a chemical compound. It's physically impossible. What he's actually implying, if you actually study it, is he's saying if salt becomes dirty or defiled, if something happens to the salt so that it can no longer be used for its sole purpose of preserving food, he goes, then what is it good for? So picture it. You get some salt. So even in our context, like you want to put salt on your food, imagine you got some salt, and you look down and you find a hair in it. Oh, it's so gross, isn't it? You look at it, and now some of you would be like, salt on your food, right? Some of you are wired that way. I'm not judging. No, I'm judging you a little bit, but you're to each his own. But when you look at it and it's dirty, you would look at it and just think, well, I can't put this on my food now. I can't use it for the purpose. So what would you do? He says, what's it good for? Nothing. You just put it on the ground. You literally go like this, and it's on the ground, and then you trample on it. And then he goes on and says, in the same way, he gives one more example, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. So he says, in the same way as salt, you're called to preserve a morally decaying culture. He says, but also understand this. You are light in a dark world. The world and the way that they're operating is in darkness. They don't know the way they're supposed to go. They're walking around thinking that everything's fine and everything's lit, but he's saying to them literally, they don't know the proper way. And so you are going to model for them and be a light by the way that you live to draw them into the right way. And he goes on to say it this way in verse 16. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And the reason I find this fascinating, because he's about to give them specific things of how they're supposed to act. So he, again, understand the context. He's about to tell them individually what they are supposed to do in their lives, but he begins by saying, but understand, this doesn't just impact you. This is a command that does impact you, but it doesn't just impact you. This is a command that will impact the entire world around you. I'll say it this way. It's like Jesus is saying this. I'm going to use the things I command you to do to save you and the world you live in. And when we understand the commands of God, that his commands to us, yes, they're right. Yes, they're best. Yes, it's to grow us individually. But it's also given to us to lead the world in how they're supposed to be, and also as a generous gift to allow us to partner with what God is doing uniquely in our world. When we understand that, then we hold, I would say, heavier the weight of the responsibility to walk in obedience. And so Jesus, after saying this, immediately launches into multiple teachings. He starts to say things like this. He says, you've heard it said, don't murder. Like you've heard that standard. But he goes, I'm telling you, don't even be angry. Like murder, that's a good thing not to do. That's kind of a weird way to word that, but that's a good thing not to do, is not to murder. But he says, but I don't want you to be angry, because anger impacts your heart, and it leads you that direction. He goes on and says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. That's true, don't commit adultery. But he says, I want to encourage you, don't even allow your mind to go to a place of lust. Don't look at people that are not your spouse in a way that is lustful and desiring them. You've heard it said that you can divorce your wife for any reason. And Jesus goes, I'm telling you, don't. Persevere in that marriage. Struggle through it. Be long-suffering in that marriage. You've heard it said about this and that. And he goes, be a person of your word. Let your yes be your yes and your no be your no. And he says things like, don't retaliate. To love your enemies. To give to the needy in an appropriate, private way. He explains to them how to pray and how to fast from food in a spiritual way. He says this really interesting thing that we'll look at in a moment. He says, don't store up treasures on earth, but instead be rich toward heaven. He encourages them not to be anxious. If you're going to judge with the right heart and in the right way. To ask what you need from God. Do to others the way that you would want to be treated, which we know as the golden rule. He encouraged them to watch out for false prophets. And then lastly, at the end of his teaching, he says, and if you will take these things that I just taught you and apply it to your life, it is like the wise man who builds his house upon the rock. When the storms of life come, they're not going to destroy your life. And as Jesus is saying this, I want us to understand, when we walk in obedience, what we start to learn is this rhythm. And the rhythm that we start to learn in our lives is, this is the best way to live. Initially, it's hard. Initially, it's really difficult because we have seen people live in such a dramatically different way that it's hard for our minds to understand that there can be a better way to live. We look at people advancing financially and we think that has to be the way. We look at people and how they look physically and we think that has to be the way, and how people respond in different things. That has to be the way. And God says, but instead do this, like to not repay evil with evil. And there's a part of us that goes, ugh. Like I can kind of understand that, but man, it feels good to repay evil with evil. Doesn't it? For a moment? Don't judge me, all of you. Yeah, you know, right? When someone says something to you and you have the perfect comeback, how many of you enjoy the perfect comeback? All right, yeah, you honest people, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, that moment, and you say, but that's what feels right, and then you start to learn. As you trust in God and you start to walk in obedience, you start to realize that there is this relational dynamic going on as you're surrendering more of yourself and you're experiencing more of the life that God has called you to. And this is what he was talking about in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount in verse 19 of chapter 6. He's talking about finances, but it's a much deeper spiritual reality. He says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And again, there's a financial principle here, but I want to talk about the spiritual principle. He says, guys, your heart and your treasures are connected. And all of the world would tell you the best way to live is to accumulate more and more money, more and more stuff, more and more resources, better house, better car, better stuff, more stuff, bigger bank accounts. And he goes, let me just tell you, that's not the best way to live. The potential is all of that is a temporary investment. It can be destroyed. It can be stolen. You can lose it. For sure, when you die, you're not taking any of it with you. And he says, let me give you a different perspective. Instead of being focused on being rich on earth, he says, why don't you have a mindset that I want to use my resources to advance the kingdom of God? I don't want to be rich toward heaven. And he says, what happens in this moment is because your treasure and your heart is connected, as you use your resources to advance the kingdom of God, the more you give of your resources, the more you're giving of your heart to God. And here's the relational dynamic that happens is when you give you get God. Not in an earning sense, but in a reality of the dynamic of a relational agreement with God is that when we die to ourselves, as we surrender more and more of ourselves and we give ourselves to God, his promise is what he will give in exchange is something that is eternal, something that no one can steal. He'll change our hearts. He'll change our values. He'll change our perspective. He'll soften the heart and heart. When we honor God, even when it doesn't feel good to us, even when it doesn't feel natural to us, he will do that so that in the end we become more and more like him. And think about it. And think about this. This is true in money in the sense that you give your money and God can get your heart. But when you want to repay evil with evil, and you say, God, I want to do this, but I'm not going to do this because you commanded me not to. I'm going to trust you in this situation. And so you don't repay evil with evil. Instead, you trust God. In that moment, you're giving a part of your heart to God, saying, God, I need you to protect my heart. I need you to soften this part of my heart. I need you to do something. You know what God does? He does exactly what you need him to do. He works in your heart and he works in your life. And in that moment, you've given more of yourself, but you've received more of God. And what God has given you is not something that anyone else can take from you. And so it leads to this greater truth. The more you give of you, the more of God you experience. And this is what he's calling us to do in obedience. He's calling us to trust him, to go deeper and deeper in obedience so that we can learn the value of this rhythm, that everything God commands us to do, it's right. It's best. It's going to grow us, so it's going to challenge us in our faith. But it is going to be the thing that leads our culture away from darkness, away from decay, into life. And God in his generosity is allowing us to partner with him. But I want everyone to hear this because that's all the intro, okay, for what I want to teach today. That's the foundation. That's the beginning. That's not even really the real good stuff, in the sense that once we understand this principle and we start to walk in obedience, it is from there that we learn to embrace generosity. Because it is in that place that we truly, in our hearts, can release all of who we are, all of our resources, all of our way of living, all of our way of thinking. We can release it to God for God to say, okay, now this is what I want you to do. And it is from there that we start to become truly generous people, because we understand this rhythm. Everything I give to God, he gives something greater back in return. And I'm not just talking about giving to get. It is a relational dynamic. The more I give of myself, the more I receive of God in an eternal way. And this is what God has challenged us to do. And so this last story I want to leave with you is in Exodus chapter 25. It is an example of a people that understood first the commands of God, but then they understood the generosity that comes from that. This is a story of the nation of Israel, and I'm just going to give you a quick summary to catch us all up. The humanity had rejected God in sin. So God allowed them for many generations to experience the full consequence of that, what it would be like for God not to be involved. And humanity went to a very dark place immediately. After some time, God decided that he was going to now launch the plan of redemption. And how he began it was he decided to call a nation to himself, his people. But instead of calling an established nation, God called one individual, a man by the name of Abram. He was married to a woman named Sarai, and then he would later change his name to Abraham and hers to Sarah. God called Abraham and said, you're going to be the father of my people. So Abraham was the first of the Jews, the Israelites. And he called him, and he said, when he called him, and this is important to know, he said, I'm going to call you, and when you walk in obedience, I'm going to lead your descendants to the promised land, this land I have for them. But he told them, he said, in between now and then, there's going to be this long experience where they're going to spend 400 years in slavery. This was part of the perfect plan of God. The reason this would happen is they would go into Egypt as a family. They would be enslaved for 400 years, but they would leave as a nation. So God, in his sovereign plan, allowed them to be enslaved so that they'd be a nation. After 400 years, God set them free, and they left captivity, and they left a nation, most likely 3 million plus people, and they left Egypt. When they left Egypt, the reality is they didn't really know God. They knew of God. As they would refer to God, they called him the God of Abraham. So they knew that they're descended from Abraham, but they would say that's the God of Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob. And it was kind of their God, but they didn't really know their God. So God leads them out, does these miracles that set them free, humbles the world power of Egypt at the time, delivers them out, is taking them to the promised land. And in the process, God is going to introduce himself to the people. And when God introduces, he speaks to them, and this is the 10 Commandments. And when you look at it, you might think, like, good grief, what a weird way to introduce yourself. Like, God looks at them and goes, like, they're all excited. Yeah, we're set free. And God goes, all right, let me introduce myself. Here's 10 rules you have to do. I mean, that's how it can look like on the surface. But where it actually begins, if you look at it in Exodus chapter 20, in the very first verse, he says to them, I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God who set you free out of captivity, out of the house of slavery. He begins by saying, guys, I'm your God. I want to be known by you. I want to know you. I want a relationship. And everything he commands in the 10 Commandments are all relational things. He's saying to them, don't have other gods before me. Why? Because other gods don't love you. They're fake. They're not real. They don't have your best interests. Don't worship them. Don't create images to them. He tells them things like, and don't lie to each other. Don't commit adultery. Don't kill each other. Don't steal from each other. Don't in any way hurt each other. I mean, these are all relational things. And so God, as he's commanding and telling them what to do, in the process of his commands to them, he says, I want you to build a tabernacle. A tabernacle is kind of hard to describe if you don't know what it is, but it's like a portable church. It's kind of the best way I can describe it. It has an outer fence made of thick fabric, and the inner part is like an inner tent, and in that place would represent the presence of God. God's actual presence would descend and be a part of that. And God wanted them to build this and take it with them. So every time they were traveling, they would take the tabernacle down, they would carry it with them in the new place that they were, they would set it up, and his presence would descend on it. And so every single place they went, here's what God wanted them to both experience and also to witness. God wanted them to have the tabernacle for them. He wanted them to experience it because at the tabernacle is the place where they would make sacrifices for their sins so that they could be in right relationship with God. And everywhere they went, he wanted it to be a witness. Now, think about this. Every single place they went and they set up, every other nation would look. And in the middle of the camp, it was literally the middle of the camp, the presence of God would descend. And during the day, it would be a cloud, and at night, it would be a pillar of fire. And every other nation would know their God is with them. Their God is on their side. And it would be a witness to every other nation. And so God says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to build me a tabernacle. But this moment was different than every other moment. This wasn't God commanding it. This was God giving them an opportunity to partner with them. And here's what he says to them in chapter 25, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the people of Israel, that they take from me a contribution from every man whose heart moves him. You shall receive the contribution for me. So Moses comes to him and says, this is what God says. If your heart is stirred, we're going to take up a special offering, and we're going to use our abilities to build this tabernacle. But he says, only whose hearts are stirred. This is a moment where he's talking about a free will offering of generosity. God doesn't say each person has to give this percentage of their stuff. Those are part of his commands, part of his law that he had already given them. In this moment, he's saying, I want to give you an opportunity to experience generosity. I want you to experience this moment, this relational moment where you give to me. And then he says to him, and when you build this, this is what the outcome will be. Verse 22, there I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. He says, that's the place I'm going to be. My presence is going to be with you. Now think about this moment. God has just delivered you out of slavery. God has spoken to you, and he says, I want to just go with you everywhere you go. But then he turns to you and says, but I want you to give of your heart. I want you to give some things that we need. And if your hearts are stirred, I want you to give. If your hearts are not stirred, then don't give. And so Moses goes to the people, and he lays it out before them, all that God needs, all the fabrics, all the types of wood, all the types of precious metals, all the types of precious stones. He talks about the candles they'll need, the oils they'll need, the yarns that they'll need, all the fabrics to make the priest outfits. He lays it all out before him. And then in chapter 35, verse 20, it says, then all the congregation of the people of Israel departed from the presence of Moses. And they came, everyone whose heart stirred him, and everyone whose spirit moved him, and brought the Lord's contribution to be used for the tent of meeting, and for all its service, and for the holy garments. So they came, both men and women, all who were of a willing heart. And so they all go back to their tents, and they think about it. My guess is they had discussions, and then they just started coming day after day. And they started to bring the things that he had listed that they needed. And they started to come, and one of the things that Moses said is, if you are skilled, if you have ability, this would be in verse 10, he said, if you had skills, if you have ability to craft things, I need you too. So Moses says, we need both resources and skilled labor. Resources and skilled labor. And he puts it out there, and the people start to respond. And they start to come back day after day after day. And I want you just to picture this. So the men and women who are the skilled laborers, the ones who can work with fabrics, the one who can work with wood, those who can work with metal, every day they're laboring to build this tabernacle. And every single morning it says that people brought more stuff to them, more stuff. So they always had supplies. But the problem was that people just kept coming. And they kept giving, and they kept giving. And finally these workers went to Moses and said, Moses, it's too much. You got to tell them to stop. And so it says this in verse 6, so Moses gave command, and word was proclaimed throughout the camp, let no man or woman do anything more for the contribution for the sanctuary. What an incredible command that you have to give, right? So the people were restrained from bringing, for the material they had was sufficient to do all the work and more. Friends, doesn't that touch your heart when you hear that? Doesn't it? I mean, can you imagine if there was ever a Sunday that I would get up and say, okay, I need everyone to stop volunteering. We just have too many volunteers. Enough. I need everyone to stop giving. Okay, you know I'm never going to say this, right? But just that part, I mean, can you imagine to say that it's just too much? And this is what Moses did. Because why were the people willing to give? Because they realized this relational dynamic. Every time God has ever asked them to give, anything that they gave, God gave back so much greater to them. They realized this relational dynamic. God was going to be faithful. If they gave of their time, God would be faithful in their time. If they gave of their skills, God would be faithful in blessing their skills. If they gave of their resources, their finances, these people were taking out their earrings, they were taking off their jewelry, they were taking their fine fabrics. There were things that they valued, that they loved, that gave them worth and even prosperity, and they were surrendering it. Why? Because they believed that there was a greater return in their relationship with God. And so, friends, today, as we think about this for us as a church, we're in a pivotal moment. We're at a moment now as we transition into this new season where we can stop and look forward and say, you know what? We have needs. We have needs as a church. Now, I want to pause and acknowledge something. You as a church have been the most incredible church that I could ever pray for as a pastor. And I'm really not just saying that. Your incredible generosity in every way has absolutely touched my heart. I've been a pastor now for nearly 20 years. It's even weird to say that out loud, but nearly 20 years. And in that time, I have never had a season where I've been more fulfilled in ministry because of just how wonderful you are as a church. Anything that we do, you get behind, and you're generous, and you're supportive, and you're the most incredible volunteers. You serve in any capacity that we need. You're generous in your finances. And as we head into this next season, through you, God has provided for all of our needs. But here's what we also recognize. This next season is going to be even greater than our current season. This next season, as we transition into a new space in a little bit over a month, we know that God is going to add to our church. Because if you study any type of healthy churches, when you go into a new facility, it is not uncommon for a church to increase in at least 50%. So I want you to think about that for a second. We're a church. In our fall months, we'll be averaging around 1,400 any given week. If we go into our new space, it is possible that in week one, and from that point on, we could go up to 2,100 and add 700 people to our church. That's 700 people that God wants us to love. That's 700 people that God wants us to disciple. That's 700 people that God loves about as His children, and He's given us not just the responsibility, but the privilege to invest in their lives. And so as we look forward, this is not me today pleading, saying, we're failing in this area, we have to do better. This is me saying, we have an opportunity. The future opportunity of this ministry, we have an opportunity to bless our community like no other organization in our community. And as we look forward and we see the need that we have, my heart as a pastor has always been one of transparency to say to you, let me just lay this in front of you and say, this is what we need. And then here's my heart. And if your heart is stirred, will you respond? If you're a guest, feel no obligation. Though the truths of what I've communicated today are true for your life, feel no obligation. You're still trying to check us out to figure out if we're crazy or not. I get that, okay? We're crazy. I'll cut it to the chase. But we love you and we love people. But if you're here today and your heart is not stirred, you're not drawn to this, here's what I say to you. Be at peace. I really genuinely mean that. Be at peace. No need to have an imaginary argument with me in your head, okay? Be at peace. But if you're here today and your heart is stirred, I want to lay before you the three things that we need in this next season. Here's the first. We need team members. And the reason I say team members is we don't value the concept of taking volunteers and just plugging them in spots. We want you to become a part of a team. And what I mean by that is we want you to find the ministry that you're best wired for, where your skill sets are, where you can thrive in that and enjoy it. But in that ministry, we want you to connect relationally with people. Our mission statement as a church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ through purposed relationships and relevant environments. We work very hard to get you connected relationally. We want you to connect in connect groups, and we also want you to connect in volunteer ministry. But we want you to find that team where you really connect and where people can love you and you can love them. And so the way that we do that is we don't just take you and fill you on a spot. We get to know you. We'll talk with you. We have a questionnaire for you today before you leave. And we're going to call you, and we're going to figure out that spot, and then we're going to try you in different opportunities. So just so I can give you some context, any given week here at our church, just to make one Sunday happen, it requires 350 volunteers. Just to make one Sunday happen through the 3 services. That's 350 volunteers. That is, and many of you have felt the love of these volunteers. You start coming in from the outside, you're going to be greeted by people in the parking lot. men that come here early to set up the parking spots because, as you know, we only have 50 spots that we own, so we park the entire city. And so they spread out, and you get that first wave of welcoming faces. Then you come toward the doors, and you see our greeters. And if you're new to our church, you come in, and there's guest agents there to help you, to feel comfortable, to answer your questions, to show you around. If you have children, you go to the check-in, and they greet you. Then you walk into the sanctuary, and there's ushers, and they greet you. We hope that by the time you find your seat, you have been annoyed at how many people have said good morning to you, how many people have smiled at you. And then in this room, you have people in the back doing the media stuff, the things you don't really see. The worship team that comes throughout the week, and they practice, and they get ready for services. We have the unseen ministries around the church, security that makes sure our building is secure. The men and women who will clean in between services just to make our space look nicer. Those who make coffees for you and drinks, and those at Connection Central. And then upstairs, the dozens upon dozens of men and women who disciple our children. And those who are in the nursery holding our babies. And it takes 350 volunteers. Do you know what that's going to need in the next building? It's going to need hundreds more. The number that I was given is, on our total roster of volunteers, we need at least 750 volunteers total so people don't get burnt out, because we don't want you to get burnt out. So that allows people to do a rotation. And our new building is going to be even greater. So what I lay before you today, if you said, Matt, what's the exact need? I don't know. But here's what I know. I need your hearts to be stirred. And if you're a part of our church, and this is your home church, and you love this ministry, you're connected to this ministry, and you're not serving, I pray today that your heart is stirred and that you respond. Today, when you came in, they handed you a questionnaire that you can fill out. It's our way of getting to know you. If you will fill that out and drop it off today, our team will call you this week, and they'll begin that process of helping you find your team. Here's the second thing we need in this season. We need skilled laborers. This is for a season. And this will be working with Pastor Joe. Pastor Joe has the most intense responsibility right now. You pray for him. I mean that genuinely. This is a very difficult season as he oversees the building project. But as we come into the end, we need men and women that can come in and help us finalize the things in the building for the next month, the 6 weeks. Here's some things that he listed. If you know how to cut foam for signs or willing to learn, to give you context, that sign behind me is a foam sign that we cut out. So we need some of those for permanent signage in our new building. If you can do light construction, like hang shelves and things like that. If you can hang signs and acoustic panels. If you can paint, in the sense that you're good at painting. So put that out there. Woodworkers. We all know some people can paint and some people can actually paint. You guys know what I'm talking about? Okay. Woodworkers, cleaners, movers to place kitchen equipment and furniture. If you know how to do landscaping. If you can do any of those things on that questionnaire, note that. And our team will follow up with you, because for the next 6 weeks, it's going to get intense as we're finalizing all the space in that area. And then the last thing that we need is we need to take up an offering, a financial offering. And I want to explain why. You have been so generous and faithful in your giving. When we started this project, the pledge that we took was $1.5 million from our church. And we would borrow the rest, but we needed 1.5, and we have brought that in. You have been faithful to give that. It's been incredible. But in the process, as you can imagine, there were some unforeseen costs. That always happens with construction. Now, I'll pause and say this. I am as proud of our team as possible. We have handled it perfectly. Joe and the team that oversees that, there has been no wasted money. I can say I'm cashing in all my credibility with you. The organization that we hired to do this, Elevated Integrity, has been 100% perfect. They are incredible in their organization. They are incredible in their generosity. The owner of the company now goes to our church. They have given back tens of thousands of dollars out of their own just to this project. He loves our ministry. I will one day introduce you to them when the project is done. He's just asked me not to do that until it's done, because it can create some headaches because people want to go and ask them a bunch of questions. So we're going to wait for that. But they have handled it perfectly. But there are just unforeseen things. Like one of them was the city said that we had to spray fireproof the ceiling. Why, you ask? We don't know. But that incredible gift cost us $200,000. And we weren't budgeting for that. On top of that, we initially were not budgeting for the land next door. We wanted it, but the people who owned it would not deal with us. The new owners have talked with us. We've agreed to it, but that's an additional $200,000, and then monies to get that to look like the way that we want it to. So at that point, we're at least $400,000 plus. Joe said there's just some other things, like you get into the wall and there was some water damage in some of the bricks that they've had to face. They had to redo the front of the church because of some water damage, things you just don't know about. And he said, all those extra costs came to about $145,000 extra. So total, that's over $500,000. Here's what I would say to you. If we took in no money from this point forward, we have the monies to be fine. We're not laying off staff, we're not struggling, we're not hurting. But we initially budgeted that we would have enough surplus in the bank that we would not have any financial stress for 2 years going into the new building, so that we could go in there and never be concerned about the mortgage, never be concerned if we need to hire more staff as God adds to our numbers. And so what we're asking is we want to take up a special offering to just build up that surplus, so that if all things go as we plan and we grow and the finances come in, it won't be an issue. We'll just take that money and we'll start phase 2 sooner than later, the gym for the new youth facility. And so that's our heart. So what we're going to do is on the night that we have our worship night, on the 28th, we're going to begin that night by taking up a special offering. And here's what I would say to you. Only give if your heart is stirred. You hear my heart on this. I'm not trying to guilt anyone into anything. I'm not trying to shame anyone into anything. I'm just laying before you. This is the needs that we have as a church. And I'm saying, if your heart is stirred, will you give? And I'm going to tell you the number that's going to shock you what I would hope for, but I just know in faith that we can do it. The number we're looking to raise in that one offering is $500,000. The $500,000 that we didn't budget for. And here's how we're going to, in my mind, how it could easily be done. I say easily, but you hear my heart. Is we have 1,000 seats in our new sanctuary. On that night, I pray we pack it out to at least 1,000. And if every person can have it of the heart to say, I'm going to give $500. $500 a person, $1,000 a couple. For some of you, that number's too big. Don't feel pressure. Don't feel embarrassment. Don't feel shame. We're not going to monitor that, okay? You will not get a call from me saying it was only $350, okay? That's not me, right? You give whatever God has called you to give, or if you can't give, don't give, all right? But for some of you, you can give that. Some of you can give 10 times that much. I believe as our hearts are stirred, we're going to give. And God is going to give us the exact amount that we need for this next season of ministry. So where we're at now is I'm going to pray for us in a moment. And here's what I'm asking. If your heart is stirred, respond today. Don't ignore the stirring of God on your heart. Let me pray. God, I'm so thankful that you are God who gives us the opportunity to partner with you. We know our shortcomings. We know how we fail. We know that in our limited perspective, we probably would have given up on us a long time ago, but you haven't. Instead, you keep calling us to do incredible things. And specifically for us as a church, you have been extravagant in your generosity to us. You have always brought the right people, the most loving, dedicated people to connect here, to love each other, to advance your kingdom. You've been generous with the staff you provided and the leadership, the elders, and our Connect group leaders. And God, I know in this next season you're going to be the same. But I pray now that you will stir our hearts. Let each one of us sense what it is that you've called us to do. Help us to give from a heart of faith and a heart of generosity. And we know, God, as we respond, that what we will get in return is to experience more of you, something that will be eternal, that no one can take from us. So, Lord, stir our hearts now, and we give you all the glory. And pray this in your name. Amen.